Hello everybody, hope you're all doing alright and you're having a good week. So we're back on to talking about the media today. We're going to move on to really just talk about print media today. Actually, I'm going to break it up. So next week we'll finish off with new media and then that'll be us done for the summer. But really today just focusing on print media, so on newspapers largely. Okay. So just a quick reminder, hopefully you already kind of know what this one is, but print media is the stuff you read in newspapers and magazines. Now, we talked about this before previously until maybe 10 years ago. This would all have been printed in a physical format. So you'd walk into a shop, you'd buy a newspaper, and you would get your news from there. Now, the vast majority of people read stuff online. So you read the Guardian website or the Daily Mail website or whatever it might be. People still do buy print newspapers. I don't know the most up-to-date statistics, but I think last time I looked, The Sun was the best-selling newspaper in the UK and sold about 1 million copies. So people do still buy physical newspapers, but less and less and less. Okay. So you'll remember from broadcast media that the law says broadcast media has to be impartial when it comes to politics. In other words, it can't be biased. So when it comes to talking about political parties or the Prime Minister or candidates for office or whatever it might be, broadcast media, the television news, has got to be neutral. That's not true for print media. The law doesn't say that print media has to be neutral, and in fact, a lot of newspapers, probably most newspapers, are biased on particular issues, or when it comes to election times. In Britain, there's a bit of a tradition of newspapers sort of telling you who they think you should vote for, and most newspapers will endorse a particular political party. So that means print media is allowed to be biased. Now, if we were in class, I would be passing round editions of tabloid newspapers and broadsheet newspapers, but hopefully you'll remember from the media unit you did in second year, or you just should know this by fourth year really, the difference between a tabloid and a broadsheet newspaper. Now, although physically there's not that much of a difference anymore because a lot of broadsheet newspapers have started printing in a smaller scale, broadsheet newspapers tend to be slightly less biased. But that's not always true. So, for example, the Telegraph is one of the last remaining physically printed broadsheet newspapers, and it is very biased in favour of the Conservative Party, in favour of Boris Johnson. So, print media is allowed to be biased. They usually are as well. Okay. So, just to understand a little bit about the idea of left and right, I'm not going to get into this in great detail, but if you look at some of the newspapers there, you can see the Daily Mirror, the Guardian, the Observer is the same newspaper as the Guardian, it's just called the Observer on a Sunday. They tend to be left-wing, so more supportive of parties like the Labour Party, maybe the Liberal Democrat Party, in Scotland maybe Labour and the SNP. Whereas much more newspapers are right-wing. So the Daily Mail, the Daily Telegraph, the Express, these are newspapers that are particularly right-wing. But also the Times, the Sun, the Financial Times, these papers tend to be more supportive of the Conservative Party. Okay. So remember what I was saying about at election time, most newspapers they come out with a front page on election day that says we think you should vote for and the name of the political party. Well, here's a breakdown of which newspapers have supported which political parties. So you can see, for example, let's take the Express there. Apart from 2001, not really sure what happened in 2001, but apart from 2001, the Express has always supported the Conservative Party. That's the blue. Okay. Whereas if you go down a couple more, you can see there in every single election since the end of the Second World War, the Daily Mirror has always supported Labour. Underneath that, they've always supported the Telegraph has always supported the Conservatives. And then you get some that are a bit more mixed. So the Times, it's kind of changed over the years. The Guardian, usually supportive of Labour, but has also supported the Liberal Democrats a bit as well. Whether or not this makes much of a difference, we'll find out a bit later on. This was also an issue during the Brexit referendum, because newspapers also picked sides on that, and because they're allowed to be biased, they could say particular things about the Brexit campaign. So you can see here the ones in blue are newspapers who tended to support Remain, so remaining in the EU. So you can see the Guardian and the Financial Times were the kind of biggest supporters of remaining in the EU, whereas on the other side of the graph you can see there the Daily Mail, the Daily Express, the biggest supporters of leaving the EU, and they would put out stories every day in the run-up to the election supporting their side of the argument. Now, the reason this matters is that if you read The Guardian, you're more likely to read newspaper articles that are supporting the Remain campaign, so you're more likely to think certain ways about issues. Okay? If you read The Express, you're more likely to read articles that are bad about the EU, and therefore you might be more likely to vote leave to get out of the EU. So here are some front pages. The Daily Express really, it doesn't particularly hide its bias. So there you can see we must get out of the EU. Not particularly confusing. I think it's a fairly obvious front page. The Daily Express doesn't want you to stay in the EU. That one's pretty obvious. Okay. The Sun is a tabloid newspaper that's quite famous for a kind of comical front pages. Quite a controversial newspaper. Really controversial headline just last week about J.K. Rowling. A lot of people don't like The Sun for particular reasons, but here you can see a kind of typically Sun headline. Corbyn, of course, Jeremy Corbyn was the leader of the Labour Party until earlier this year. You could probably identify from that front page the biases. The Sun is telling you don't vote Labour, and you can see up at the very top actually they've said vote Tory. Tory is another word for Conservative. So there's bias as well. The National is a newspaper that you only get in Scotland, and it's written just to support Scottish independence. So it's a newspaper that has a bias in favour of independence. So their front pages tend to always have headlines that are critical of the UK, or critical of the idea that Scotland is being ignored somehow. So you can see in this front page here, there's a bias there against whatever it is the issue is to do with the UK Parliament at that time. Daily Express. So this is a front page that's about migrants. Now you might think one article here or there doesn't make a huge amount of difference. And opinions like this about immigration, well, it's the Daily Express, it's one newspaper article, surely that's not going to make much of a difference. But newspapers tend to put out the same kind of stories over and over and over and over again, so that if you buy that newspaper, you become sort of, those are the stories you expect to read. You become very persuaded by those stories because you're seeing them constantly. So look at that one headline from the Daily Express: we must stop the migrant invasion. And then look at this. You can see here, this didn't even take all that much effort to pull together, but look at all of these front pages from the Daily Express, all of them critical of migrants, calling it migrant chaos, or illegal migrants, or benefit cheats, or the migrant flood. This is the language that this newspaper uses because it's very anti-migrant. So you won't get a story in there, for example, talking about how hard migrants work in the NHS or anything like that, because their bias in that newspaper is anti-immigration. So you get front pages like this over and over and over again. You also get loads of pictures of the Queen because the Daily Express is a bit obsessed with the Queen and Princess Diana. Okay, so there's one example of bias. So this is a really famous front page that you don't really need to know very much about, and I don't expect you to know who Neil Kinnock was, but it's a famous example of newspapers on election day claiming that they have been responsible for a party winning the election. So Neil Kinnock was the leader of the Labour Party. There was a general election in 1992. Neil Kinnock was sort of supposed to win that election. People thought he would. He went up against John Major, who was the Conservative, but in the end, John Major won by quite a significant margin. And the Sun claims that it was their front page that won that election. Now, you can believe that or not believe that. I think it's quite unlikely that a front page won the election, but newspapers think that they have an influence that maybe they do, maybe they don't, but they certainly argue they have a significant amount of influence. Okay, so last bit before I set you some tasks. The role of print media is to influence as well as inform us. So whereas broadcast media is mainly about informing us, it's about giving us information, print media has a lot of responsibility in influencing voters one way or the other. Historically, because lots and lots and lots of people bought newspapers, they were seen as very, very powerful. The owners of newspapers were extremely powerful people. So politicians would often go to great lengths to get newspapers to support them. It's not quite true anymore, but a newspaper front page that's bad for the government can still be a major problem. So often politicians do still do a huge amount to try and get newspapers on their side. So they'll do interviews, newspapers even run campaigns sometimes on particular issues, and they'll try to persuade politicians to do things. So newspapers are still really influential, even though not so many people buy them as they once did. And they tend to drive the agenda for the day. So if you think about yesterday, there was a whole set of newspaper headlines about a Manchester United football player who said that we should be paying for free school meals during the summer holidays. Now, he had a lot of influence on Twitter and on social media as well, but newspapers ran with it on the front pages, and that drove the whole story for the day, and politicians had to spend all day responding to it. So they do have an impact on politics. So today's task, I'll post this in the team as well. What I want you to do is pick 2 newspaper websites and have a look through them. Look at a few stories that interest you, click on a few things, read a bit to get a sense of how newspapers write their stories. But I want you to try and find a similar story that 2 different newspapers have covered. Okay, so it could be something to do with, try and avoid anything to do with coronavirus. So try and think of a political story, okay? Look it up in 2 newspapers and then read the 2 articles and compare them. And try and do it with a kind of clear head. Do you come away with the same information from both newspapers? Or was there a different perspective? Did you detect any bias in that newspaper? Okay? Some newspapers, because people aren't physically paying for them anymore, they sometimes have a paywall on the internet. In other words, you can get a few articles for free and then you need to start paying. So just try and find articles that you don't, I'm not expecting you to pay for them, obviously. So if you can't get into them, that's fine. The Guardian, I think the Telegraph, out of those ones, the Telegraph's probably the only one that has a paywall. But just try and see. You might need to Google different articles and see how you get on. Okay? Have a go at that. Post in the team if you've got any questions. Otherwise, have a really, really good day. Have a good weekend when it comes. Take care of yourselves. And I'll see you all soon. Goodbye.